And the best way I can do this in the very short time I have is say you have three Islams. Islam 1, 2, and 3. Islam 1, the Quran and the life of Muhammad and the Hadith. Islam 2, the tradition of the Sharia. Islam 3, what Muslims do now. The first of those things, Islam, the Quran and so on, is bad. It is bad. There is a lot of violence in it. And what's worse, the peaceful verses are superseded by the violent verses. The violent verses also, sadly, are more numerous in number. Then you've got the life of Muhammad. Again, a bad man. A very bad man, it has to be said. Not a great role model, if you look at it. It takes child brides, abuses a small girl, multiple wives, himself a warrior, himself a war criminal, himself beheads Jews. This, I would have thought, would be a signal of not great peacefulness. Then you've got the tradition of the Sharia. Again, not great peacefulness. Still, no schools of Sharia that people in this hall would want to submit to. And thirdly, what Muslims do now. Thankfully, there is some hope in that one. Because most Muslims, thank goodness, I almost said thank God, but old habits die hard. Most Muslims don't do what those texts say. Because they exercise their judgment as moral beings without having to refer to defunct holy books. Now, the problem is that Islam is an unstable component, as a religion, an unstable component. 1,000 years ago, the Mu'tazilites tried to reform the religion. They were wiped out. The fact is that Islam is many things, many, many things. But to say it's a religion of peace is nonsense. It's to ignore reality. It's to ignore very difficult but necessary facts, not paradigms, but facts. To say that Islam is a religion of peace is to say something based entirely on hope. It's to elevate a hope into truth. And I hope, as you all know, history teaches us that's a very bad thing to do. Thank you.
To Osama bin Laden, if he were to tell you the 4 or 5 things, you say it's not about just moving troops out of Saudi Arabia and getting the settlers out of the West Bank. So what is it? If they want this to be a worldwide effort, I get back to my question, what could stop the terrorists, or is there anything that can stop these terrorists?
Well, I think that there's no concession that can stop.
You can't bargain.
There's no bargaining. The purpose of these terrorist acts is not to bargain with us. This is not like some labor union engaged in a struggle with the boss, and somehow the boss's yacht gets burned down, and it's an act of terror. But everybody understands that it was meant to force a deal.
You can't buy them off.
It's not like that. The goal is to overthrow the whole of liberal or secular civilization and create a new world, a completely new world. So the only thing that's going to defeat them is really the only thing that's going to defeat them is to persuade them to abandon their ideas. Really, the only thing that will defeat them is to win a war of ideas.
When you talk about the Islamic world, are you taking into account the different Muslim cultures around the world, such as those represented in Jordan, Israel, the United States, Iraq, Turkey, etc., and their varying views of interpretation on the Quran, which in effect changes the ideologies of those certain groups and cultures?
Well, sure, that's a very huge question, but there are several considerations we can have about it. There are obviously these immigrant communities all over the world. There is no country where there are no Muslims. And so when I speak about the Islamic world, I do mean to include them, yes. And there are several considerations about this. One is there are varying interpretations of the Quran, and there are varying interpretations of Islamic law. There are actually 4 schools of Sunni Muslim jurisprudence. The Sunnis are 85 to 90% of Muslims worldwide, and they are mostly the ones in the countries that you mentioned. I believe Jordan, Israel, the United States, and where? Turkey. Yeah, most overwhelmingly Sunni populations. There are 4 schools of Islamic law for Sunnis, and every Sunni Muslim adheres to the view of Islam, the understanding of the Quran that is taught by one or the other of these schools, the Shafi'i, Maliki, Hanafi, and Hanbali. Now, each one of those schools they all agree that it is part of the responsibility of the Islamic Ummah, the community, which is not just a set of nations, but is anybody who identifies himself as a Muslim, collectively, wherever he may be. It is part of the responsibility of the Muslim community to wage war against unbelievers in order to either convert them to Islam or subjugate them as inferiors under the rule of Islamic law. Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, taught that you first invite non-Muslims to convert. If they refuse that, then you invite them to accept the second-class status, the dhimma, the contract of protection. And third, if they refuse both of those, to go to war with them. These things are taught by all four Sunni schools, as well as by the Shiites. So on that, there's no disagreement. Now, does that mean that every Muslim in the world is pursuing this? Certainly not. There's a spectrum of belief, knowledge, and fervor among Muslims, as there is among any community that identifies itself by any name. And certainly if you consider yourself Christians, or Jews, or Hindus, or Buddhists, that really doesn't tell us anything much more about what you actually think about things than we knew before. Because there are so many different ways, so many different levels of knowledge, levels of understanding, levels of commitment among people who identify themselves by those terms. So there's a remarkable variation in that regard, but on the other hand, a remarkable unanimity in terms of the teachings themselves. And that makes the peaceful Muslims an ever-fertile recruiting ground for the more radicalized ones, because they're able to point to chapter and verse and say, this is your responsibility as a believer, you have to do this. And they're able to convince people that way. This happened in several notable cases in the United States, where very nominal believers were approached by jihadist recruiters who were able to convince them on the basis of the texts of the Quran and Islamic law and tradition that this was part of their religious responsibility. And so I think that while it is true there are many interpretations and people in many states in life, we have to realistically understand that there is no community, I should emphasize that there's no sect of Islam that is considered orthodox by the rest that has ever renounced the ideology of violent jihad or the subjugation of non-Muslims. And until that happens, these things can always be used to incite people to violence as they're being used today.
And these religious principles actually are different as you move from religion to religion. I mean, as I've said before, no matter how fanatical someone becomes as a Jain, the core principle of which is nonviolence, they're not going to fly an airplane into a building over their humiliation or grievances, because it would be a repudiation of everything that they've organized their life around. And so it matters that at the core of Islam, there are principles like martyrdom and jihad. It really matters that Islam views itself as a religion that will be victorious in this world, politically and materially. That there will be a true Islamification of the planet. And that people will either convert or die, or Christians and Jews will live as called dhimmi, as in some kind of apartheid situation where they pay a protection tax. This is the view of moral order that you get from Islam, and it really is. It's not the crazy Al-Qaeda, I just went to a training camp in Afghanistan Islam. It is mainstream Islam. And one of the problems we have is that many Muslims, for understandable reasons and some for really deplorable reasons, are playing hide the ball with the articles of faith and are eager to have conversations of the sort you have had from a very cynical and manipulative perspective. We're just going to keep having big families, and eventually it's going to be Eurabia, and the war will be won. There are people who really think in those terms, and they're not necessarily just the people in the center of the bullseye of Islamic infatuation. They can be several cantos out, just the kind of people who would never blow themselves up, but who think it's a good thing that some people will.
But in fact, the world has completely altered. And if you look at those statistics and then nudge it on a bit, what will those numbers look like in 2020, 2030? We won't even be able to do them. We won't even be able to say, well, the developed world's fallen to 12%, the Muslim world's population has increased to 28%, because by 2030, much of what we think of as the developed world will be part of the Muslim world. And that is why it behoves America, which has stronger advantages than any of the other countries that we think of as part of the West. Because the big difference is, for America, this is a conventional war. You go to faraway places, you kill foreigners. In Europe, it's a civil war. It's subjects of the Queen who blow up the London Tube. It's citoyens de la République Française who riot and burn and torch the cities of France every night. It's a civil war for them. And so we have to understand the planet is changing very fast, and that America needs to use its moment now, or we really will face a new dark ages.
However, the battle goes on, because it's not merely bin Laden who has to be taken on and defeated, but the narrative, the ideology that Islam is in a fundamental battle with the West that has to be confronted, taken on, defeated and eliminated.
Is this the culture that Islam wants us to have in relation to it? One of, if you like, preemptive submission, preemptive cowering, backed by the fear of force? Because that is not multiculturalism. That's nothing like the gorgeous mosaic. That's actually the absolute negation of what a multicultural system would be like. And a multicultural system has to look rather askance, I think, on a religion whose preachers and websites openly make threats against people like myself, against the Jewish people, against the Hindus, who, for heaven's sake, aren't even monotheists, can be killed on almost any pretext. Where is it? Where is the authoritative statement of moral outrage in the city world saying this is not acceptable behavior for followers of the Prophet? I missed it. And so apparently did the followers of the Prophet miss it, because they keep on doing this all the time. They were doing it before the United States got to Iraq, and they'll be doing it after we've gone.
All of whom are Muslim. As are so many of the rape gangs in Australia. The gangs of men who groom young white women in Britain as sex slaves. The people who burn poppies on Remembrance Day, who commit honour killings, who make no-go areas for non-Muslims, and on and on and on. Now, a phobia is usually assumed to be an invalid, unnatural fear, but tell me, what is invalid or unnatural about fearing a religion that in its heartlands of the Middle East and parts of Asia is intolerant, that denies freedom of religion and speech, that exhibits a hysteria and an anti-intellectual violence that would have shamed a medieval crusader, that treats women and minorities with a clawing disdain, that rejects progress, and that moans about persecution each time it is exposed? It is not I, not the West, not Canada, that jumps into the mud of female genital mutilation, Holocaust denial, punishing women for being raped, hanging homosexuals, turning children into suicide bombers, committing acts of terror on innocent people, murdering others of the same faith with a satanic glee.
It was attacked on the 11th of September in the name of Islam. They tried to destroy the White House, destroyed the economic symbol of the United States, destroyed part of the Pentagon, and have vowed to destroy and are prepared to go on doing this in the name of their faith, even when they themselves die. Right. With that kind of conviction, you have to sit down and ask yourselves, what on earth is it that they want? Now, the list of arguments from the 11th of September was there's poverty, the American foreign policy, and so on. And we see up to the Glasgow bus that this just doesn't add up. So at one point, you have to understand that there is conviction behind this. So if you treat this in the same way as, say, Catholic aggression in the 15th century was treated, Nazism, communism, that this is ideology motivated, it's belief motivated, then you try and understand why. Why are they winning hearts and minds? What is wrong? What is it that they're giving? What is it that we're not giving? Then the situation is going to look different. I'm not saying that we should say it's the war on Islam. But from a genuine point of view, I have no idea what else to call it.